It doesn't make sense to try and process a file that doesn't exist, so what we're going to do is come back to the file processor here and to the process method, and we're going to add some code to check whether or not the specified input file exists. To do this, we can make use of static methods on a file class that comes from the system.io namespace. So let's start off by saying if not file exists, and then as a parameter to this exists method, we need to specify the path of the file to check. In this case, it's the path held in the input file path property. Notice that we didn't have to add a specific using directive to the system.io namespace, because by default, when we created this .NET 6 console application project, it made use of implicit namespaces. One of those implicit namespaces is system.io. All we're going to do for the minute is write out an error message to the console window saying the file doesn't exist, and then just exit the process method. Let's build this to make sure we haven't introduced any errors, and the build succeeds. And if we head back to File Explorer, notice we've still got data1.txt inside the in folder. What I'm going to do is delete this and come back to Visual Studio and once again run the application. Recall that we've still got those command line arguments set in Visual Studio. And because we deleted data1.txt from the input directory, we've got our error message here. While we're in the process of adding some file checking code, we can also make use of a feature to check whether or not a path is a fully qualified path or not, or as the Microsoft documentation describes it, quote, whether the specified file path is fixed to a specific drive or UNC path, end quote. To do this, we'll come back to the program file, and we'll come up here where we're checking for the -- file option, and after we've got the file path from the command line arguments, we're going to check if the path is an absolute path. In this application, we're not going to support relative paths, only absolute paths. To do this, we're going to make use of a static method on another very useful class when you're working with files, and that's the path class. The path class provides a whole host of useful functionality when you're creating file processing applications. The specific path method that we're going to be using here is the isPathFullyQualified method. This is a static method on the path class. As a parameter to this method, we need to specify the path that we want to check. In this case, it's the file path from the command line arguments. We want to negate this. So we'll say if not path.isPathFullyQualified, then just output an error message telling the user that the file path must be a fully qualified path, wait for the user to press enter, and then return from this method, which will essentially exit the console application. So the isPathFullyQualified method returns true if the path is fixed to a specific drive or network UNC path. It returns false if the supplied path is relative to the current drive or working directory. So let's come up to the data processor debug properties, and we'll modify the command line arguments here to make this a relative path. We're going to remove the absolute portion here where we're referring to the C drive, and we'll just close that, and once again run the application. And now we can see our error message telling us that the path must be fully qualified. If we change this back to the original command line arguments, once again specifying an absolute path and run this again, we no longer get the absolute path error message. Another useful thing to be able to do when working with file paths is to be able to find a parent directory of a given path. Let's take a look at this next.